Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, a warm welcome to FIIA's first NATO in Focus seminar, which is dealing with a very topical subject today, NATO's deterrence and collective security. My name is Dr. Iro Särkkä, and I work as a postdoctoral fellow at FIIA's new research program on Finnish foreign security policy, Northern European security, and NATO. And it's my great pleasure today to moderate this seminar today. So, first of all, a practical note, this seminar will be recorded, so you all know it will be posted probably on YouTube later on. And also, it's the first seminar dealing with NATO, with series of seminars hopefully we'll be organizing next year. But today, we talk about NATO's deterrence and defense. And one could say that NATO is once again in transformation, and Russia's brutal attack on Ukraine has shifted NATO's emphasis on its core task, deterrence and defense. We all know that the new strategic concept, which was approved at the Madrid summit at the end of June this year, emphasized the significance of collective defense and deterrence and the urgent need to develop NATO's defense posture. But in practical terms, how will the alliance strengthen its deterrence and defense, and what defense capabilities are needed to bolster NATO's collective defense? Will the allies be able to bridge their divergent preferences and threat perceptions? And what kind of implications will Finland's and Sweden's entry into the alliance have for its deterrence and defense posture? And how will Finland's accession in NATO affect defense planning in Finland as well? So these are the kinds of questions that we would like to ask today from our wonderful keynote and guest speakers that I will introduce to you next. First, our keynote speaker, Dr. John R. Denny, is a research professor of joint interagency and intergovernmental and multinational security studies at the Strategic Studies Institute at the U.S. Army War College. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and a professional lecturer at the American University Schools of International Service. He has previously worked as a political advisor for senior U.S. military commanders in Europe, and prior to that spent 2 years as a strategic planner specializing in the military-to-military relationships between United States and European allies. He was also a lecturer at the Heidelberg University Institute for Political Science, where he taught graduate and undergraduate courses on US foreign policy, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, European security and alliance theory and practice. He has completed a number of degrees as well, holds an MA in US foreign policy from the American University of Washington, D.C., and a PhD in international affairs from George Washington University. And he is an author and editor of several books, which one of them I have here with me. Some of you might recognize it, NATO and Article 5. For instance, peer-reviewed monographs and journals. So, Professor Denny, you're warmly welcome. Then next I will introduce Karoliina Honkanen. Ms. Karoliina Honkanen is the Director of the Office for NATO Integration in the Defense Policy Department of the Ministry of Defense in Finland. From 2019 to 22, she was the Head of Strategic Planning in the Ministry of Defense and served as the Secretary General for the Government Defense Report in 2021. During 2014 to 17, she served as a defense counselor at the mission of Finland to NATO in Brussels. And before and after her assignment in Brussels, she worked as a ministerial advisor at the Ministry of Defense, focusing on Finland's cooperation with NATO. And in her previous assignment, she has worked in the field of strategic planning, both in the MOD Defense Command in Finland. And prior to that, she actually worked as a researcher at FIIA. And last but not least, we have Dr. Matti Pesu, who is a leading researcher at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. And his research interests include Finnish foreign security and defense policy, Northern European security, and Euro-Atlantic security. And currently, Pesu is leading FIIA's in-house research project on Finland's evolving role in Euro-Atlantic security. And the research report, together with another FIIA researcher, Tuomas Isomarkku, will be published sometime in the near future. So, without a further delay, we will proceed to interesting presentations by our guest speakers, and this will be followed by Q&A and discussion. So, Professor Denny, the floor is yours.
Excuse me, upon arrival of my Austrian Airlines flight, the flight attendant announced upon landing, "Willkommen in Finland, willkommen in Winter." And so it's nice to see an early taste of winter here in Helsinki. We have nothing like this where I come from right now. It's still very fall-like. And it's also a very appropriate time to be talking about these topics, I think, given that today is the anniversary of the opening of the Winter War here many decades ago. A reminder of the challenges that you face here, really on the front line, so to speak, with our Russian neighbors. But before I begin, let me note that because I do work at the Army War College, the U.S. Army War College, and even though we have academic freedom, I must note that the views I'm going to express are mine and mine alone, and don't necessarily reflect those of my government or the Pentagon or the U.S. Army. So I want to thank, before I start also, I want to thank FIIA and Matti for the invitation to join you and speak to you today. Where I come from, FIIA has a well-deserved reputation for excellence in public policy and international security work. And so it was both a pleasure and frankly an honor to be invited by this organization to come and speak to you today. I'm also honored by your presence. Thanks for joining us today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about NATO's deterrence and defense posture. I've been asked to talk for no more than 30 minutes, and I'm going to watch the clock behind you all there to make sure I stick to that. And in those 30 minutes, I think we're going to start by discussing a little bit about the history of what those of us that study and track NATO might call NATO 1.0 and NATO 2.0. That is NATO's first iteration. And how we got from one core task to three. This is critical to understanding where NATO is today and the challenges that it has in terms of achieving its objectives in collective defense. We'll then talk about NATO 3.0, really the period since 2014 and the alliance's efforts to re-embrace collective defense. Since earlier this year, that effort to achieve NATO 3.0 has really been on steroids. And I'll talk with you about what that has looked like. But of course, there are challenges in this regard today, and I'll talk about those in a way that any War College professor would, and that's in terms of an ends, ways, means construct. And then finally, we'll take a look ahead and examine NATO and China, the U.S. commitment to Europe, and the O in NATO, the organization. And throughout this, I'm going to be trying to draw out some of the implications specifically for Finland and for your neighbors in northeastern Europe. All right, NATO 1.0. NATO 1.0 was all about collective defense. The images you see here before you, the first one on the bottom left, a picture of part of the Reforger exercise in 1982. This was an exercise, a massive one, that occurred almost every year during the Cold War and a little bit into the 1990s. And Reforger is a phrase that, almost an acronym, meant Return of Forces to Germany. And it was an effort by my country to send about a division's worth of troops, figure 15 to 20,000 soldiers, across the ocean on short notice to show that we could reinforce the Allies in the event of hostilities begun by the Soviet Union or the Warsaw Pact. And you can see here how U.S. troops are tearing up some German farmland there, for which we would pay them, but we would go off the exercise terrain and out into the countryside. This had a number of important effects, right? It signaled to the locals, to our allies in Europe, that we were no kidding around going to be able to meet our goals and our objectives and our commitments in Europe, but it also signaled to the adversary that we were capable of getting here quickly and in force if we had to. At the height of the Cold War, of course, alliance forces were up against the Soviet border, the Warsaw Pact border, right? We had the so-called layer cake defense at that time across the inner German border. You can see those different flags of countries, and it's small text there, but if you could read that, it shows you the core dividing lines, CORPS, back in a time when we could all field corps in NATO, no longer the case today, but the core dividing lines and who was responsible for what regions, okay? The dotted arrows above show where Americans and British troops would be coming into the continent from offshore. But this was the name of the game from 1949 up until about 1990, end of the Cold War, collective defense. There were efforts to go beyond that. My country very interested in getting European allies into Korea and Vietnam, Europeans less so. In some cases, European allies interested in getting Americans involved in fights in colonial settings. We were not so interested in that. So really, this was the name of the game, the focus for many years. NATO 2.0 begins at about the end of the Cold War and continues through about 2014, okay? Now, collective defense was still one of NATO's core tasks, okay? We weren't going to give that up. And there was serious doubt in the early 1990s, if you can recall that time 30 years ago, about the outcome, frankly. Remember, put yourselves back in that place. The Soviets had endured a coup at the end of the Soviet Union. It was uncertain about whether and how all of their forces would be withdrawn from Eastern Europe. That took many years. And so this effort to shift out of merely collective defense was very slow. So the alliance maintained this commitment to collective defense. But we added two new core tasks to the central mission of NATO. The first of those was crisis management. And we saw this play out initially in Bosnia in the form of the implementation force and then the stabilization force, or I4 and S4. We then had a commitment in Kosovo, part of the KFOR was the force we had there. ISAF was, of course, the largest of these crisis management missions, but there was also Libya and then support to the African Union. A third core task was cooperative security. And you can see the examples, numerous examples I have listed for you here, beginning with the Partnership for Peace, but including efforts to reach out to former adversaries in Moscow and elsewhere. All of these efforts designed to facilitate a reduction in tensions across the continent. Now, in addition to these three core tasks, the alliance had an array of other activities. You see them unfolding here before you. Some of these were started during the Cold War. They existed prior to NATO 2.0, but many of them began in this NATO 2.0 era. So there's a lot of stuff up here, right? I can't overstate the changes that all of this meant for the alliance, right? There's a lot going on here in this NATO 2.0 period of roughly a quarter century. 25-year period in which the alliance really begins to move away from the ability to conduct large-scale maneuver warfare. The kind of fighting we see going on today in Ukraine, that kind of fighting the alliance has gotten away from. Unable to do that in 2013, 2014 at the end of this NATO 2.0 era. We see changes in doctrine. We see changes in our manpower. Nearly all allies shifted from conscription to professional military forces. There's a professionalization that goes with that, but it means also a reduction in capacity. We see changes in equipping, right? All NATO allies got less heavy. Some allies gave up armor entirely, like the Dutch, right? Or my country removed all of its heavy tanks from Europe. All these changes, dramatic, okay? This is very important to understand because it paints a picture, it foreshadows the challenges that we are now undertaking in trying to achieve NATO 3.0. Okay, dramatic. If I showed you a chart, I have this chart, but not in this slide package, of American presence on the continent of Europe, a steady, inexorable, but steady decline of American forces in Europe from 1990 down to 2014, okay? At one time, the U.S. had, if we count all the services, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, about 400,000 troops in Europe at the height of the Cold War. You couldn't drive across Germany without seeing Americans. We were everywhere, right? By the time NATO 2.0 is about to end, we're down to about 50, 60,000 Americans in Europe. Okay, a dramatic reduction. Really, almost a pacification of European defense. Okay? So this is what I point to when I hear folks from the adversary talking about, the threat posed by NATO enlargement. That's nonsense. Any objective assessment of European defense through this 25-year period has to point to a reduction in the threat, an objective reduction in the threat posed to Russia across all of Europe. So, this is the state of play in 2013. 2014, NATO finally realizes it has to re-embrace Article 5. The cyber attack on Estonia in 2007 didn't convince NATO of this. The war against Georgia, 2008, didn't. It took the conflict, the first invasion of Ukraine, to convince the alliance. And then we see a series of dramatic changes unfolding that year, beginning in 2014. The first is the adoption at the Wales Summit in September of that year of the so-called Readiness Action Plan, the RAP. And I've highlighted for you here some of the major parts of that Readiness Action Plan. But it was multifaceted. It included creation of what we call the VJTF, the Very High Readiness Joint Task Force, as kind of the spearhead of the NATO response force. There was an expansion of the NATO response force itself, but this VJTF was a 5,000 soldier strong brigade size with appropriate air and soft elements. Tip of the spear. It would be the quick reaction force. That was new, or new since NATO 2.0. We had that in the Cold War, but we gave it up. We also saw the creation of these new NATO force integration units among a number of East European allies. These units are designed to help, units is a strong phrase, these command element. Thank you, Sven. These command elements are designed to help facilitate the flow of forces from allies into Eastern Europe. And of course, we saw for the very first time the development of the placement of NATO forces in the East on a continuous basis. Again, this did not occur in NATO 2.0. It did occur following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. These enhanced forward presence units are multinational battle groups, anywhere between 1,000 and 1,300 troops or so in each of the Baltic states and Poland. And then we had so-called tailored forward presence in Romania and Bulgaria. Other key elements of this re-embrace, we see the 430s initiative unveiled in 2018. This was an effort to try to increase readiness on the part of the European allies, be able to deploy 30 air squadrons, 30 surface combatants, and 30 battalions, all within 30 days. There have been command and control, or C2 changes. We've seen the development, or I should say the redevelopment, of a strategic command in Norfolk. What used to be called SAC-LANT, or Strategic Allied Command Atlantic, had gone away during NATO 2.0. But we realized in NATO 3.0, no, we actually do need to pay attention to be able to get stuff, materiel, personnel across the ocean in the event of hostilities. And so we created Joint Force Command Norfolk. At the same time, we realized the importance of getting beyond the beaches of Western Europe and flowing forces and materiel across the continent to where there might be hostilities in the east. And so we're in the middle of standing up the Joint Support and Enabling Command based in Germany. And then finally, we've tried to make it a little bit easier for the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, the American four-star, dual-hatted as commander of NATO forces in Europe, but also commander of U.S. European Command, try to make it easier for that commander to get forces ready in the event of hostilities, realizing that we've got challenges in terms of being able to react quickly enough as a collective organization. But frankly, this has not been enough. And so what we have seen this year is NATO 3.0 really on steroids. It began with an expansion of the permanent U.S. presence in Europe, but also growth in the rotational presence of U.S. troops in Eastern Europe, specifically in terms of command and control, fires, that is artillery, rockets, etc., and other enablers. We've seen the Enhanced Forward Presence Initiative expanded to 4 more countries in Europe. And we can debate the utility of that, but it's politically very important, in some cases operationally so, but we're seeing this initiative grow. We finally have a new strategic concept. This has been a real problem for the alliance. The last one was written in 2010. There were good reasons for it not to be updated following 2014. There were many in the alliance, especially those in Europe, who thought that the change we had seen in Russia might be simply a passing storm, not climate change in an international security sense. And then, of course, in my country, the presidency of Donald Trump made many Europeans reluctant to see that concept rewritten during his tenure. So that concept is now finally being rewritten, and it holds some pretty important key changes now. The first is this shift in language in the core tasks. Now, the language that is key to me, I've highlighted for you in the text box in the upper right here, and that is that the key purpose of the alliance is now collective defense. Remember before that was one of 3 core tasks. Now it has become the key purpose. The other core tasks all remain. We've renamed that one to defense and deterrence. But now all 3 are in service of collective defense. Those of you who track this kind of thing realize that that's a pretty significant change for the alliance. It's subtle, but it's a big deal, and I think we're going to see the implications of this play out over the coming decade. The new strategic concept is very clear on the threat. The threat is Russia. It references China in language that the drafters were frankly surprised that they were able to get approved through the alliance. And then finally, another significant change as a result of this NATO 3.0 on steroids is this commitment to revising the NATO force structure with the development of the new NATO force model. Now, this is still being fleshed out. You can see the diagram depicted there kind of depicts the core of it. Within a few weeks, there should be roughly 100,000 troops. Within 10 days, 100,000 troops ready to go, ready to be employed within Europe. Within a few weeks of that, another 200,000, and then follow-on forces of up to 500,000. So this will take the place, for the most part, of the NRF, and it represents a commitment on the part of all the allies to significantly increase their capacity, because right now this would be tough to meet that demand, but also to increase their readiness. This is being fleshed out right now by NATO military authorities, and we're going to see more of this debate unfold within NATO next year. So this is NATO 3.0, an effort to try to get back to its core mission set, that is collective defense. It's not easy, and now I want to talk to you about those challenges, again, in an ends, ways, means construct. First, it's clear that Russia is now the most significant and direct threat. That's language directly from the new strategic concept. I think critical questions that Europe in particular, or European allies in particular, have yet to address is whether this really means the end of the interdependence dream. The notion that we can only achieve security in Europe with Russia instead of against it. I think the sense in some allies is that that is no longer possible. We cannot achieve security through trade and interdependence with the Russians. Does this mean that we are destined for confrontation with the Russians? If and when Putin leaves the scene, he just had a birthday, right? He's 70, now over the age of life expectancy for Russian males of his generation. So he may not be around forever, right? Certainly won't be. But if he leaves, does it matter? There's a school of thought in my country, and I think among some European allies, that it's going to be really difficult, given Russia's conflation of territory with security, its view that might makes right, that some countries matter more than others, all of that on the one hand, with the Western notion that individuals have liberty, countries are sovereign, and everybody gets an equal vote within NATO. Can those two things coexist? I'm not sure, without there being some friction. As a consequence of this, if there is going to be continuous friction, as we try to cast our gaze beyond the current war, what does NATO force posture need to look like going forward? You see here, the chart depicts Russian losses as of mid-November or so. I can tell you there's an emerging sense in my country regarding, in the security community in my country, regarding the strategic loss that Russia is now undergoing. We think that's a good thing. And it's epitomized by the destruction of a lot of their land power capability. Of the roughly 463 battalion tactical groups in Russia, 447 of them, or roughly 97%, are committed to the war in Ukraine. Of that number, 110 are assessed as not mission capable right now. That's about a quarter of the force devoted to the fight are not mission capable. This is a significant degradation of Russian military power. So what does that mean in terms of the kind of capabilities, the kind of forces that my country, but also other European allies, need to have on the Eastern Front as we try to shift from deterrence by punishment to deterrence by denial? I think if you read my country's national defense strategy very carefully, and I'll get to this in a minute in one of my last slides about the U.S. commitment, you'll see that we are limiting the number of forces that we are willing to make permanently based in Europe. We're going to limit that to things that we think the European allies don't have enough of or can't do adequately. So you're going to see us focus on command and control, fires, artillery, and enablers. Those three things I mentioned before, those posture changes. That's where we'll make an effort to maintain our commitment to European security on the ground on a permanent basis. Otherwise, I think you'll see more use of rotational presence on the part of the U.S. in Eastern Europe, and we will look for European allies to do more on the ground. As we embrace this new strategic end focused on Russia in the European context, we need to begin to break down this arbitrary dividing line between peacetime on the one hand and conflict and wartime on the other. NATO is slow to get there. Right? We don't like to have the alliance operating typically during peacetime. NATO operations, typically it's we're either in peacetime doing cooperative security, or we're doing crisis management and collective defense in times of conflict. That gray area in between is an area where the Russians excel, the Chinese too. So the alliance needs to think more about this among its objectives. And then finally, what I call the new Nordic nexus. The fact that Finland and Sweden will soon be members of the alliance means an increased focus on the part of the alliance on this part of the world. By definition, the alliance's center of gravity is going to shift somewhat. And that's a double-edged sword, right? We're going to be bringing into the alliance two very capable militaries with countries that know the adversary very, very well. But it also expands NATO's area of responsibility. We have to think about this part of the world in different ways than we did before. Now, what about the ways, the funding? Or I should say, not the funding, but the tools that we're using. This is a bit of an eye chart. I don't expect you to read all of it, but I want you to draw your attention to the dark blue parts of the graph, okay? These are figures from NATO itself, published middle of this year, showing the percent of each ally's funding devoted to the various categories that NATO tracks. And you see them listed at the bottom. Personnel is the dark blue category. And then the lighter, as we go up, then personnel, then operations and maintenance, and then infrastructure, and then finally major equipment or acquisition and related R&D. Does the alliance have this balance right? You can see there's lots of variation here. Let me draw your attention again to that dark blue, the bottom bar. The black line I've depicted here is the NATO average. You can see there are some countries that are way above the average on personnel. That means they're spending less, by definition, on acquisition or operations and maintenance. And the allies that I'm worried about are, what, the Italians in the middle, the Portuguese I see, the Spaniards, Bulgarians. Thank you. So these are the countries that I'm concerned, do we have this balance right? I'm not so sure we do. Now let's talk about the means, the funding. You can see here the chart depicts only European NATO defense spending since about 2000. You can see we bottomed out in 2013, 2014. Clearly a response to the changed threat environment. Not merely Russia, also ISIS, things unfolding in Syria and Iraq. But it changed, threat environment yielded a changed reaction to that in terms of defense spending. This is a good news story, right? It's going up in the right direction. We can debate whether individual countries are pulling their weight. Some are accelerating that faster than others. But this is going in the right direction. Will that continue? Will it continue in the face of inflationary pressure? Questions about the endurance of the durability of the Russian threat? And then what will happen with the Defense Investment Pledge when it hits its 10-year mark? You might know or recall in 2014, the alliance made the Defense Investment Pledge to spend 2%, the equivalent of 2% of GDP on defense, and 20% of defense budgets on acquisition and related R&D, okay? That commitment existed prior to, the 2% commitment at least existed prior to 2014, but in 2014, for the first time, it was agreed by heads of state and government. Big deal. That's a big deal, okay? What happens in 2024? Do we declare success? We're done? We hit it? Got there almost? Not really. Do we renew it? Or do we replace it with something else? I can tell you in my country, the sense is that 2% needs to be a floor. We need to go above and beyond that. Because we've proven we can't yet achieve deterrence by denial, which needs to be the objective in Eastern Europe. All right, so now that I've laid out for you challenges in re-embracing NATO 3.0 in an ends, ways, and means framing, let's look ahead. First, China. As I mentioned, groundbreaking language in the strategic concept regarding China. In my country, we view the Chinese threat as one that is cross-domain. And I mean that in a military term, economic term, even a societal term. If you read our national security strategy, which just came out as well, you'll see that we talk about Chinese and Russian governance systems as a challenge, right? What kind of a world do we want to live in? It's really the question facing the West and my country in particular. We view these things as problematic. Our hope is, even though our Secretary of State traveled to Europe in March of 2021 and said we're not going to make Europeans choose, our hope is that Europe is not contested terrain and that Europeans view the challenge the same way we do. I think there's plenty of evidence to support Europeans doing so, and I've depicted one example of that in this bar graph here. Every day, your military enterprises, your governments are subject to thousands of Chinese cyber attacks and Russian cyber attacks, just like my country is. Yet this is not the subject of your public discourse yet regarding the Chinese threat. In addition to this, they're actively working to steal your intellectual property, especially with regard to dual-use technology. And the Chinese have shown a keen interest in European infrastructure that has military relevance, including ports, railroads, electricity, energy production. So this is an area where I think there needs to be more emphasis within NATO's thinking, and especially across the European allies. Now, at the same time, I know there are residual concerns amongst our European allies about the endurance of the American commitment, right? We saw Joe Biden and the Biden administration, frankly, make some missteps last year with regard to European allies. The AUKUS agreement among them and the somewhat chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, not highlights of 2021. I think the Biden administration has learned from that. I think you see evidence of that this year, improved their approach to Europe. But we also have this Trump hangover, right? How enduring is this commitment on the part of the Americans? If in 2024 Trump or someone of his political style, political views, comes to office in my country, what does that mean? I think the polling data shows that Trump did not move the needle on U.S. commitment to European support. And if you'd like, in the Q&A, I can show you some charts that indicate where the U.S. is today in this regard. But I think there are strong reasons to believe that the United States remains as committed as ever to defending every inch of NATO territory, every square inch of NATO territory. And I think that the U.S. government has made good on that commitment throughout 2022 in numerous ways we can get into in Q&A. Now, some of the implications of the Biden strategies. I mentioned first the national security strategy, the overarching document. Our approach is twofold with regard to the adversaries. Compete with the Chinese and constrain the Russians. That sounds a lot like containment, doesn't it? I think it does, and I think that's our objective. But constrain their ability to threaten vital Western interests. I think we're on our way there. With regard to the national defense strategy, though, there are a couple of key implications for Europe. First, we want more combined planning with Europeans. The NDS is very clear. We want European allies involved in every stage of combined planning. That's a big deal. Secondly, we want to increase combat power on NATO's eastern flank, especially in defensive A2AD. Anti-access, aerial defense, anti-access. Right? That's essentially turning what we see in Kaliningrad with the so-called air defense bubble, reversing that and creating the same along NATO's eastern flank. That's going to be a key area of emphasis for my country moving forward. And here Europeans can play a critical role, including Finland. And then thirdly, we're going to remain focused in the long run on the pacing challenge in the Indo-Pacific theater. That means we're going to expect European allies to pick up more of the challenge in Europe, in and around Europe, especially once we get beyond this acute part of the war, once we get beyond the war. So again, an area where European allies, including Finland, as a security provider, not merely a security consumer, will be expected to play more of a role. And then finally, the things that Americans will bring to Europe. What are we going to keep in Europe in terms of an enduring presence? I think you're going to see us focus on these three areas as spelled out in the National Defense Strategy. All right, finally, I'm running short on time, so I'm going to give you the short version, condensed version of this slide. But the O in NATO, how do we get more countries, more allies into the upper right quadrant of that chart that shows above 2% and above 20%? That remains a challenge. And we have ongoing issues with regard to NATO 3.0. First, is the Article 5 bar too high? It's an awfully high threshold. Much of the challenge presented by Russia doesn't cross the threshold of armed conflict. much of the challenge to NATO allies, and instead exists at this gray zone level. Article 5 may be a bar too high. Part of that is reflected in the fact that the alliance remains focused on response, reaction, and as the alliance grows to soon 32 members, it gets more difficult to reach consensus. Remains a consensus-based organization. That becomes necessarily difficult as the alliance grows and countries bring their own perspectives to the debate table. And then finally, speed of decision making. Can we match the speed of the adversary? I think there are real serious concerns about whether NATO can still do that, and whether it's done enough to meet that challenge. And with that, thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions and answers.
Okay, thank you, Professor Denny. That was wonderful. And next we turn to our next speaker, Ms. Karoliina Honkanen, please.
Good afternoon, and thank you to FIIA for organizing this event on such an important topic. Dr. Denny gave an excellent overview of NATO's development and on the different phases in the development of NATO's deterrence and defense posture. I will follow up with some comments from the viewpoint of Finnish defense sector. Let me first point out that many of the topics that we are discussing today are such that we don't yet have formal national positions on many of them. So that's why I will be talking here today more in a personal capacity than as a representative of the Ministry of Defense. I will touch upon three topics. First of all, our approach to deterrence and defense, and secondly, Finnish integration into NATO, and thirdly, a few words on NATO's deterrence and defense posture. First of all, about our approach to deterrence and defense, and how does it match NATO thinking. Dr. Denny went through the different phases of NATO's development, ending up with NATO 3.0 on steroids. When we look at the development of Finnish defense, the focus has not changed. It has remained steady throughout the decades. The main purpose of our defense has always been to deter any use of military force against our country. And the main task of the Finnish defense forces has always been the military defense of Finland. And due to our geostrategic location and our history, this has never been put into question. We have developed our defense in a systematic way with a long-term perspective and as a whole. The purpose has been to ensure that the defense readiness and military capability for repelling attacks meets the requirements of the operating environment. Our defense model combines quantity and quality. We need a large, well-trained reserve, but we also need critical high-end military capabilities. Our defense spending reaches 2% of the GDP. Around 50% of the defense spending at the moment is allocated to procurement. We have taken good care of our resilience, relying on our long-term model of comprehensive security. So my conclusion is that our long-term national efforts have been in line with NATO's renewed focus on enhancing deterrence and defense since 2014. We fit well into NATO 3.0. However, while we have been doing the right things, our focus has been very much on the national perspective. And as a future ally, we need to start thinking about our defense as part of the collective defense of NATO, of the whole alliance. Let me now turn to my second topic, Finland's integration into NATO, a very topical task at hand in the defense sector. As you all know, Finland has long been a very close partner to NATO. We have had wide-ranging political dialogue with the alliance. We have had deep, pragmatic military cooperation with the alliance. We have participated in NATO's operations and exercises, and our defense forces has a high level of interoperability. Despite all this, I would argue that transition from a partner to a full ally will be a very big change for us, especially in the defense sector. As a partner, even as a key partner, enhanced opportunities partner together with Sweden, we have only seen a scratch of what NATO is, how NATO functions, what are the key goals and purposes of NATO as an organization. And we have also been part of only in a fraction of NATO's activities and meetings, because as it is evident that even key partners were outside of decision-making and outside Article 5 activities. So this is why I argue that joining NATO will be perhaps the biggest change in the Finnish defense since the wars. I have identified 3 elements of change. First of all, we have a huge pragmatic workload ahead of us, especially in the defense sector. It means increasing personnel in capital at our mission to NATO in Brussels and in different NATO structures. It means that we need to allocate significant additional resources and also adopt new ways of counting defense expenditure and reporting about it. It's about harmonizing our national legislation, certain parts of it, so that we can fulfill the requirements of being an ally. We need to make sure our facilities and communication systems fulfill NATO criteria. And importantly, we will join new processes like NATO defense planning process, operational planning, and integrated air and missile defense when we become a member. The second element of change is that we need to form national positions on security and defense policy questions more widely, including in new topics such as nuclear policy of NATO. And thirdly, in addition to this pragmatic workload, as I see it, joining NATO is also going to be a change of mindset, a cultural, mental change. Our long-time point of departure has been the national defense, independent national defense capability, and now we are moving on to become a military aligned country. So in addition to national perspective, we will need to take into account the overall needs and requirements of the alliance. So the work is ongoing in the defense sector, and I have full confidence that all this is doable, but we also need to be realistic. It will take time. It will be a gradual process taking several years, and it will require additional resources and perhaps some legislative changes. Then I will move on to my third topic and say a few words about NATO's deterrence and defense posture. In his excellent remarks, Dr. Denny mentioned NATO 3.0 with steroids. I would say that it could be even more than that. It could be NATO 3.5 or even NATO 4.0. Implementation of Madrid decisions will take NATO's deterrence and defense to a new level. But we have to remember the caveat here is that everything will depend on implementation of the Madrid decisions. It is about maintaining unity in the alliance. It is about making a long-term political commitment to significant additional resources. So many of the challenges and shortcomings that Dr. Denny presented in his remarks. But there are certain elements that I find important in NATO's deterrence and defense poster. I have listed 4 of them. First, a clear commitment to nuclear weapons as part of NATO's overall defense, overall deterrence. So NATO's nuclear shield has helped to deter Russian aggression against NATO members. Secondly, a stronger eastern flank. The logic of defending the eastern flank will change. It will move from a tripwire model to forward defense, from deterrence by punishment to deterrence by denial. And there is some strong language in the new strategic concept on this, but obviously it's a work in process and will take time. And thirdly, there is the possibility of increasing readiness through the implementation of the new force model and a better way to organize the troops. And fourth element, more efficient planning, a new set of operational plans on how to defend the alliance, and perhaps more regional expertise and more training between in-place forces and reinforcements. So to conclude, as we have heard today, there is a lot going on in NATO. Many aspects of NATO's deterrence and defense are under transformation and being discussed in the alliance. So what does it mean to us as a new member? First of all, we don't yet know all the impacts of our membership on a detailed level. We are certainly jumping into a moving train. We don't have all the answers yet, but we believe that we will bring added value to the alliance, and we are very much looking forward to cooperate closely with all the alliance, with all of the alliance, and make NATO stronger together. Thank you.
Thank you, Karolina, so much for your thought-provoking views and insights on what Finland's NATO membership will look like. And now we're going to turn to our last speaker, Dr. Matti Pesu. So Matti, floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Iro. Distinguished audience, dear colleagues, I'm going to make 3 short points on NATO's deterrence and defense posture. I think many of my views echo what John and Karolina have already said, and my views are partly based on a study that we're about to release soon in the coming weeks, either before or then after Christmas, we'll see. And my first point relates to Finland, and the 2 remaining points deal with kind of broader trends regarding NATO's first core tasks, namely deterrence and defense. But the first point. So the primary reason for Finland's application and ambition to join NATO and seek applying for NATO membership was a perceived deterrence deficit. Namely, in the wake of the Russian second invasion of Ukraine, there was a widely shared view among Finns, I'd say the public and the elite alike, that the existing security and defense solutions were insufficient in relation to the heightened Russian threat potential. But I must say that public opinion was a decisive factor pushing Finland towards the NATO path instead of alternative paths like non-NATO defense cooperation and intensifying different defense networks. NATO membership in and of itself will beef up Finnish deterrence, as its allies will now formally be committed to the defense of Finland, and of course vice versa. Moreover, as a NATO ally, Finland's focus will be on developing NATO's deterrence and defense posture. Finland will be a deterrence-oriented NATO ally. And Finland's NATO accession will bring more predictability, clarity, and I'd also say robustness to the international dimension of Finland's defense policy. In other words, potential wartime reinforcements and operational cooperation do no longer rest solely on ad hoc solutions or coalitions of the willing, but on NATO's defense plans as well as its command structure. The second point is that the Russian war of aggression has not yet brought about a major paradigm shift to NATO's deterrence and defense posture in Northern Europe, that is in the Baltic Sea region and in the High North. As been pointed out at the Madrid summit, the alliance committed to deploy additional in-place combat-ready forces on its eastern flank to be scaled up from the existing battle groups to brigade-size units, quote, where and when required, underpinned by credible, rapidly available reinforcements, pre-positioned equipment, and enhanced command and control, unquote. And NATO allies here in the Baltic Sea region have quite convincingly, in my opinion, argued that NATO should really change its strategy to a deterrence by denial approach in which the alliance would have more allied forces in place to deny and repel an armed attack, instead of current very high reliance on reinforcements. But whether the decisions made in Madrid really amount to a change in NATO strategy from to forward defense or to a deterrence by denial model really hinges on the alliance's capability and determination to reinforce the theater early enough. And this again necessitates sufficient number of troops in high readiness. Now the ambitions have been set in the new force model, and then well-rehearsed defense plans, for example. And there still remains a lot of work to be done in this respect. And my final point is that the future direction and development of NATO's deterrence and defense posture will first and foremost depend on how allies perceive the Russian threat. So although the alliance's new strategic concept states that, quote, the Russian Federation is the most significant and direct threat to Allied security and to peace and stability in the Euro-Atlantic area, unquote, there is still, and understandably so, diverse views within the alliance on the degree and intensity of the Russian menace. And furthermore, as pointed out by John, it seems rather evident now that the Russian armed attack against Ukraine is actually weakening Russia conventionally, and its ability to rebuild its military strength will depend on actually several factors, such as the state of its economy, domestic or regime stability, as well as its access to advanced technology, and these are all factors that still remain unclear. Allies on NATO's eastern and northern flanks will undoubtedly consider Russia as an acute threat, simply because Russia has shown intention to use force against its neighbors. But how about more protected allies in Western and Southern Europe? Are they willing to follow through their commitments to spend more in defense and making more forces available to NATO? Or is there enough determination to further enhance NATO deterrence and defense posture? I think these are questions that remains to be seen. But I think I shall stop here, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Matti, for shedding insights to your new research as well. Since I'm moderating this event, I'm using this rare opportunity to ask the first questions, which I normally don't. So I was thinking about, John, your presentation and NATO being on steroids at the moment, and whether there will be, like Karolina said, NATO 4.0 approach. So my question to you really is that if you could, I would challenge you to contemplate what would that mean if we think of NATO 10 years ahead from now. I mean, history shows that we never are able to predict the future. I mean, none of us really thought that Russia would be attacking Ukraine 10 years ago. So what would that entail in terms of threat perception, balance of roles and tasks within NATO? Do you reckon that we will have, again, NATO, which will be balanced in between the collective defense and crisis management? I mean, whether it's going to be either or both. And then again, about the means. What would that mean in terms of, the sufficient means? Now we have a hard time achieving that 2%, 20% targets. Would that mean practically increasing again, defense spending up to a new level? Also, what would that mean for Finland as a NATO country? Are we ready to go on that debate whether to send troops overseas, such as Indo-Pacific, Sea, China? What would that mean for Finland? So that's my first question, and I wonder if you would like to answer that first before we take questions from our distinguished audience. And maybe I'll put the mic in the middle. So
You've asked a very easy question. Cast my gaze 10 years ahead and tell you what I see. It's interesting that Karolina mentioned NATO 4.0 in a version of my talk to you today that predates February 2022, excuse me. I actually talk about a NATO 4.0, and that is one, in my view, that would be focused on threats beyond the European theater. And so it's difficult right now, obviously, to cast our gaze beyond the smoke of the current battle, right? It's difficult to see what the Russian threat will look like. My country, as our military and civilian leaders have made clear, is interested in a strategic defeat of the Russians. We think we're on our way there, thanks to the hard work of the Ukrainians, but also Western support for the Ukrainians. If that's achieved, and somehow we envision a Russia that is unable and maybe unwilling, but probably more unable than unwilling, to threaten vital Western security interests, it's feasible that Europeans may be able to cast their security horizon, more Europeans, cast their security horizon beyond, let's say, the Mediterranean or the high north. Currently, the number of allies that can do that or are willing to do it are very small, right? I think of the French, which maintain the only ally to have sovereign territory in the Indo-Pacific theater and nationals there. The Brits, which have a historically had sort of a global strategic horizon. Maybe the Germans, given their interest in trade. I'll remind you that the Germans, as well as all Europeans, get a larger percentage of trade through the South China Sea than my country does. So there are good reasons to think that Europeans may be able to look beyond Europe 10 years from now. I think there are too many variables at stake to determine what that will look like in its final form. But clearly, my country envisions the generation-long competition with China as something that we will need allies to contend with. I mentioned to you this change in language, center of gravity language. That implies that if we don't get that assistance, if part of the center of gravity or if one of the centers of gravity fails, then we lose. So it seems to me it will be in America's long-term interest to bring Europe along with us. And I think you'll see us continue to press European allies, including Finland, to do more where they can. First, by focusing on the Chinese threat in Europe today, the security threat. It exists. It's not getting enough attention for good reason. Let's deal with the acute threat first. But ultimately, Europeans should and do, I think, care as much about the global commons as we do. If If that's the case, you have to care about what happens in the Indo-Pacific. And you'll see us continue to pressure those allies that are able and willing to join us in that effort.
Caroline, thank you. What I meant by NATO 4.0 is actually full implementation of Madrid decisions, full implementation of the new strategic concept. If we look at the strategic concept, it has quite a strong language. It gives guidelines for NATO to go ahead with the forward defense and a stronger posture. But implementation of that all, that is the challenge. It will require political commitment, resourcing, maintaining cohesion in the alliance, and also regarding threat perceptions. And that would, implementing it all would take easily 10 years. If you look at development of defense, it's always very long-term business. There are no quick gains. But I also agree that NATO needs to focus on the Indo-Pacific and on China, understand more, and be more aware of the Chinese challenges to European security, and deepen partnerships with the Indo-Pacific partners. But at the same time, I see that when it comes to the military role of NATO, NATO will defend Europe, and the geographic focus of NATO's role as a defense alliance will remain in Europe.
Matti.
In terms of NATO 4.0, maybe 2 points are connected. First, a more capable Europe. That's needed, especially in light of the coming transatlantic adjustment related to China's rise and the emergence of the Indo-Pacific theater. And then secondly, a potentially regional division of labor also within NATO. That's one option. And there is still, I'd say, increasing potential in also allied cooperation outside NATO structures, and those initiatives better supporting the overall objectives of NATO could be a part of the NATO 4.0.
Okay, that certainly answered my question. Maybe I even had 5.0 in my mind, thinking far ahead. But now it's time to give floor to you, the audience, and I can see many hands up. We start the right corner with, left-hand corner with Juha Pyykönen, and then a gentleman here. And third question, I think, gentleman here in the stripy suit. What I would kindly ask you to do is to tell your name and introduce where you come from, so our dear panelists know to answer. And then I'm taking names down, so keep your hands up, and I will take note of them. And we'll take these 3 questions first, and after that we'll move on to the second patch.
Thank you, Iro. I'm Juha Pyykönen. I'm a security researcher nowadays with some military background. One publication in the US Army War College series titled Deterrence in the Nordic Baltic Region, just for your information, 2019. And this actually is the basis for my concern, how our dear friends in Norway are doing in future. Being there alone for 37 years, no strong NATO neighbor in the vicinity, but bordering Russia, and based on the recent discussions how things would change in our region here in the Nordic northern eastern flank of NATO region, I haven't seen so much talk about what would be the role for Finland and Sweden as NATO members to support the northern flank of NATO. As we have heard today, we have been talking about the eastern flank mostly. So my question would be for John Denny primarily, how would you see, what would be the implication or implications for the northern flank of NATO when Finland and Sweden will be members of NATO? Thank you for your excellent contributions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sven Sakko, Estonian ambassador. Juha, by the way, northern flag now soon stretches to the Arctic Sea. So there's no either or. But John, good to see you here in Winter Wonderland. Two questions. One is, and in a way, if maybe anyone at the stage would want to take a shot at that. First is that how much of the changes these kind of 1 to 4.0 in NATO have been actually actively pursued by NATO, and how much have been reactive? So, by the way, I think it's for the future historians to wrangle further, but I would have added another one kind of NATO, which would be NATO in Afghanistan, meaning faraway operations, light forces, by the way, which also led to a lot of military capabilities, what are needed for fighting a near-peer adversary atrophy and to rot, because you were not able to put them into C-130 and fly them to Afghanistan, and they were deprioritized and not invested in. So that's first one, and second one is about how do the people at the stage actually think of how long term the Russian threat could be. I mean, yes, I mean one person is 70 years old, but Russia is not just one person, even though it is embodied in one person. My own take would be that Russia has been a menace for European security since probably, I would say, 1558, the start of the Great Livonian War, if not before, and will be another 500 years, regardless of who is at the helm. Meanwhile, just for some time, we have pretended it's not there, covered our ears and eyes, and sung basically lullabies to ourselves. So kind of a, by the way, and that ties to one very topical issue in NATO, which is, for example, I have no idea whether anyone has, whether, for example, NATO-Russia founding act is dead or alive, which is absurd by itself, that we do not know because it has not been declared dead. It's not declared alive too. Thank you.
Yes, good evening. My name is Antero Eerola. I'm a journalist and I'm also a member of the advisory board of the Defense Information with the Ministry of Defense of Finland. Now, joining NATO is one thing, of course, but at the same time, the Finnish government is planning to have a bilateral defense agreement with the United States. And my question actually is maybe to Karolina Honkanen, that why is this bilateral agreement needed? What are the main advantages of this kind of agreement besides NATO membership? And maybe the same question also to Professor Denny. And what are the objectives of the United States in this bilateral defense cooperation with Finland, and especially in terms of this kind of a special agreement?
Okay, I think we're going to stop here to take the first batch of questions, and we start in chronological order. Do you all recall for the 3 questions? Also, I think you can comment any of them if you like. So maybe we'll start with Professor Denny relating to Norway and Nordic flank and regionalization and what can be done. So yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, the question about what role for Finland and Sweden in the northern flank. I think there are 2 significant changes. The first that we will see is I think in my country we tend, maybe in Europe as well, we tend to view these 2 theaters, that is the High North and the Baltic Sea, as 2 very distinct theaters or regions. I think with Finland and Sweden in the alliance, we can more readily view that as a unified area, which I think will enable us to make better use of limited resources in both regions. And so my hope is that we take a more holistic look of Northern Europe, and rather than separating them out in terms of how we plan for and think about potential operations there. When it comes to things like command and control, I have argued as recently as this past August in a policy brief for the Atlantic Council that because of its capabilities and expertise and because of geography, Finland ought to focus on land operations in the high north, and Sweden could be the new location of a combined air operations center for NATO devoted to the high north. But again, perhaps unifying or taking a more unified approach to both the Baltic and the north. And again, the goal would be to leverage resources in both areas, depending upon where the need was. So I think there's going to be greater synergy, and my hope is greater efficiency on the part of all of the allies in this part of the world, this part of Europe. Sven, to your question about changing to NATO, this new iteration of NATO, whatever we're going to call it, has it been active or reactive? I think it's been obviously reactive. And that is, I think, the great criticism of NATO. It's one of its Achilles heels. That is, and I highlighted in my last slide, the alliance tends to react and respond to things. That is as it should be to some degree, right? This is the nature of a collective defense organization made up of sovereign states. It's not necessarily always going to be leaning forward. We try to, through centers of excellence, for example, where we have the time and the ability to think big thoughts and think beyond the smoke of today's battles. We try through the policy planning unit within the Secretary General's office at NATO to think forward and get out of a reactive response mode, but that's difficult to do in an alliance. And so I think it has been mostly reactive, but that's by definition part of the challenge, part of the way NATO operates. Your views on the nature of the Russian threat, I couldn't agree with more. In fact, in this book, to put a plug in, thank you, Eero, for bringing this, there's a whole chapter devoted to how we treat the Russian threat. I and others in my country who have long studied the Russian threat believe that it doesn't matter whether Russia is led by czars, Politburo chairmen, or so-called presidents. There is an incentive structure built into Russian politics, whether that's the politics of authoritarianism or otherwise. There's an incentive structure that encourages Russian leaders to demonize the West, also the East and the South, but certainly the West. That incentive structure isn't carved in stone. We saw a brief break from that incentive structure between 1993 and 1996, but it returned then in Yeltsin's second term. That incentive structure will exist during Putin, after Putin, and well beyond Putin. And so this is why you saw on one of my slides, I talk about an era of, not an era, but a unrelenting conflict, friction between Russia and the West. I think that is inevitable. And that, I think, it means for us in Europe that we're going to have to focus, at least to some degree, on the Russian security threat, as Carolina was saying. My hope is that through our efforts, multi-domain efforts, in the military, economic, political, diplomatic spheres and realms, that we can diminish Russian power over time. I think we're getting there, but the threat will endure. I think the question is the intensity and strength of it. And then finally, with regard to the bilateral defense agreement, sir, you should know that this is a common thing between the U.S. military and our allies in Europe. It's becoming more common. For example, the agreement to have U.S. forces based in Germany, or the fact that American forces are present in Poland, those will all occur under a bilateral agreement. That's not a NATO agreement per se, but rather an agreement between the U.S. and its bilateral allies. There's, of course, an agreement that we call the NATO SOFA, the Status of Forces Agreement, that is sort of a NATO base level agreement, but we typically negotiate agreements beyond that that are more specific and particular to the nature of our presence in countries. That's not to say we're planning a presence in Finland, but this kind of an agreement would help to spell out the kind of future defense relationship the U.S. would have with Finland. And I think it makes sense if we're thinking about a long-term relationship such as we would expect with an important ally like Finland.
Yes, thank you for the question. Also, as a NATO member, we will continue our other defense cooperation. We have a wide network of multilateral and bilateral defense cooperation relationships. And actually, NATO membership gives new opportunities to deepen some of the existing partnerships we have. And as Dr. Denny mentioned, it's one possibility is this bilateral agreement with the US, a very important way to develop our defense capabilities and interoperability and strengthen security in the region. And also other NATO members have similar kind of agreements.
Just briefly on Juha Pyykönen's question. So last week, Finland, Sweden and Norway signed a new agreement on enhanced operational cooperation. Didn't get that much coverage in the media, but clearly gives a hint on the direction of evolving Nordic cooperation. There'll be a heavy emphasis on operational cooperation, joint operational planning, something that was only discussed and coordinated between the three respective armed forces, but now there's much stronger planning element enabled by Finland and Sweden's coming NATO membership. Thank you.
Okay, we'll go to the second batch of questions then, and I could see at least 2 hands up. We had Admiral Kaskala here in the front row, then we had Ambassador Newberry next, and then we have 2 more hands up here at least, so you over there, and then you go next. So yes, maybe Admiral Kaskala over here in the front, so thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the interesting presentations. And my first comment actually goes to Professor Denny. You certainly mentioned that, which is true, that Finland is expected to be a contributor rather than consumer of security. It would be very unwise in NATO defense planning to weaken the Finnish defenses as such. We are one of the frontal states towards Russia. There's only Norway, Finland, partially Poland. So whatever you can do to bolster the defense and deterrence of Finland would be wise from NATO's perspective, Finland as a member state. And here of course, I can have some numbers, 280,000 troops, which is one of the biggest armed forces in Europe. We have long-range weapon systems. And this is actually my question now. The joint fires, which where we have had several officers in Norfolk since 2005-06 to study joint fires, we now are going to have in our inventory MLRS rocket systems with 150 kilometer range. We're going to have what we already have, the 62 F-18s with 380 kilometers range. JASM and with F-35s potentially double the range all the way to Moscow if you need. And then we are going to have our ships are going to have a surface missile system with 220 kilometers on ground targets, 8 ships. So if you count all the launchers, hundreds of them altogether. And you've seen the impact of the HIMARS weapon systems in the war in Ukraine. So we are the only country in Northern Europe to have such a long-range deterrence, and I very much emphasize the word deterrence. We're not going to attack Moscow, but we have the threat there. And then, could this be one of the assets which in NATO defense planning would be taken sort of from our national control to joint control, since these weapon systems have really proved their efficiency in deterrence? Or should we rely on that these are national systems, in our national systems, which are part of course, NATO, but under national command. So this sort of international or NATO joint fires, is that a concept that would be there? And by the way, I would very much hope that NATO should actually increase the target of 20% of new procurement, what we have, to 50%, because it's the structure of the defense budget, not the sort of a level 2% or 3%, but what do you buy, what do you get for the bang for the buck?
Thank you. And then we take the next question in the row as well at the same time. So yes, Ambassador Newberry. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Iiro. I'm René Nieberg. I'm a former ambassador to Moscow and Berlin. And I'd like to thank Professor Denny for an interesting presentation, and I'd like to have your charts, if it's possible. Will they be available?
I can make them available.
Well, thank you very much. Just a comment to General Pykkönen about Norway. I mean, days after Finland and Sweden admitted their application to join the alliance, the Norwegians had a military transport transfer transiting northern Finland and northern Sweden. So they knew, we know, they know, and this is the idea. I take 2 points. One is the point of Russia facing a strategic defeat. That's something we all hope for. But that will mean will have enormous implications. The day the Russian armed forces are not anymore able to fight, when they lose their fighting capability, bojespodobnost means political consequences in the Kremlin. And we don't know what's going to happen, so it's absolutely we can't speculate. But a risk of a kind of a revolution is possible. And the day this strategic defeat is a fact, the Wagners in Africa, the plug will be pulled on them. The day this happens, Russia will not be able to maintain its presence in Syria, with implications for Turkey, with implications for Israel, and implications for all of us because of Iran. These are big, big things. And the third thing is, of course, that Africa will be for Europe, will be and stay for Europe one of the issues. Look at the difficulties the French have, how they've mishandled Mali, and look at the Germans who were sent to Mali and trying to learn French because that's the only language you can use there. So there are a lot of these kind of things. My second point, and I'll stop there, is Germany. There will be no European real defense effort without Germany. Germany is the country, the largest by population and industrial capability. It has a military which is underfunded and has lost its purpose. It's undermotivated, and this the Zeitenwende, which is a fact and will happen, is one of the biggest things. There will be if you think about military capabilities, only Poland is developing real military capabilities. I'm not about, I don't dismiss France and Britain. They're all important players. But without Germany, there will be no European capabilities. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you for the distinguished speakers and panelists. It was a nice presentation. It's good to have you here. Just a couple of weekends ago, I was boots on the ground rehearsing with some reserve and having lunch with the US Marines who are present here in the country. I have to admit that it was a relief to feel that we are not all alone in this corner of the world. But yes, I have a question, a clarification about the used rhetorics. We are referring to, or you are referring to, systemic sciences, metaphors and language when speaking about the the antagonist governance in the world. Also, there was this term about Russia, that the Russian dream of interdependence, or the interdependence with Russia, is a pipe dream. In the history of sciences and systemic sciences, which are used in the basis of these rhetorics, interdependence is known as a fact since the 20s. And in rhetorics, truth-based rhetorics is kind of a cool thing to rely on, especially when you're headed towards a fight against an antagonist. So my question is to you, Professor Denny, about the choice of rhetorics. Why is interdependence called a dream? And I'm a PhD student at Helsinki University. My name is Markus Petterilainen.
Very nice, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. Okay, gentlemen, thank you.
Yes, my name is Charles Murto. I'm now retired, but I served 46 years in the Finnish diplomatic service, and I had 4 postings as ambassador. I was ambassador to Australia and Spain, France, and lastly to Canada. Thank you for your very interesting presentations, all of you. My question would be more to Professor Denny. You already mentioned sea lines of communication, which are always very important. Now with Finland and Sweden joining NATO, there will be 4 Nordic countries that are Arctic countries. Then you have Canada and the US. And if you look at sea lines of communication, you already mentioned that SACLAND has been replaced by a new structure. That's good. But how do you see in the future the Eastern Passage, the Northeastern Passage, and the Northwestern Passage? During the last few years, more ships have been using the Northeast Passage, but that obviously is very much controlled by Russia, who has a tremendous amount of icebreaker capabilities. And also, if you look at the rail connections between Europe and Asia, they go through Russia. Now, in the future, the Northwest Passage might be more necessary. It also connects the Atlantic to the Pacific. How would you see that developing, and how do you see the role of NATO as regards to the Arctic? Because what Finland and Sweden also bring is capabilities in icebreaking, which are lacking, and to some extent in North America. Canada and the US do need icebreakers.
Okay, thank you. We stop here, this part of questions. So we have 4 questions lined up already. You probably wrote them down. Yes, brilliant. So we start with Professor Denny again, and then we'll move on to Karolina and Matti.
First, Admiral, to your questions about the investments that Finland is making in its long-range deterrence stability. Yeah, these are critical and will play an important role today and tomorrow regarding our deterrence of the Russians. Will they be figured into NATO defense plans? I hope so. My concern right now, frankly, is that there's a bit of a disjoint because of the cycle of the NATO defense planning process, the development of regional plans, which is occurring now, and accession procedures of Finland and Sweden. Those 3 things aren't lined up as much as I would like to see them lined up. When I raise these questions, though, with NATO international staffers and with national delegations to NATO, there's not as much concern. They think that there is room to sort of correct any alignment mismatch later in 2023 or as 2024 unfolds. But my hope is that preliminary discussions, informal discussions between Finnish military experts, Swedish experts, and the NATO alliance, the staff, are going to help get those things in alignment over time. Now, regarding the question of whether those forces will be removed from national control to joint control, you know, as you may know, NATO per se doesn't really have military forces. The NATO organization, there are some shared airborne warning and control aircraft that operate out of an airbase in Hungary, but the alliance per se does not have military forces. It relies upon the forces contributed to operations by the member states. So in this sense, I wouldn't expect to see Finnish military assets go out of Finland's military control. Even if Finland were to contribute those assets to a NATO-endorsed operation, as it has done in places like multinational operations in the Balkans or in ISAF, they're still ultimately maintained or controlled by the Finnish government, right? If Finland decides to pull those forces out, they can do that. And so I don't think there's any risk of those forces being taken out of Finland's control. Or out of Finland. Well, that really depends on the nature of the operation, right? I mean, it's possible, as we saw in ISAF, that there may be a demand for some military forces in some part of the world other than northeastern Europe. If the security situation permits that, Finland may decide that, okay, we can take that risk and we can contribute forces. As you may know, when there's a NATO operation, the alliance goes through what they call a force generation process, where basically NATO staff looks at all the allies and says, okay, here's the list of things we need. We need this many tanks, this many aircraft carriers, this many jets. Who can contribute? And then the alliance members contribute their forces to that operation. Finland may say in that instance, we can't do that. We've got these challenges at home in our backyard. That would be a reasonable response. Or it may say, well, we can afford to send a handful of F-35s. It's impossible to guess, right? We don't know what the situation will look like. Ambassador, to your question about Russia's strategic defeat and the role of Germany, I agree with you that there are clearly second and third order effects of the strategic defeat. I think many in NATO are hoping that some of those effects you mentioned, a reduced Russian role in the Middle East, a reduced Russian role in Africa, are things that actually play out. With regard to Germany, I completely agree with you about its role, its linchpin role in Europe. In a book I wrote as a follow-up to this one, that just was published last year, and it's rather pessimistically entitled Coalition of the Unwilling and Unable, I examined the trajectory of 5 key allies from America's perspective in Europe: the Brits, the French, the Germans, the Italians, and the Poles. And I examined their economic trajectory and their demographic trajectory to try to get a sense of their military strength over the next 10 years, that is the end of this decade. And frankly, it's a pessimistically entitled book because me as a Europhile, student of NATO, and an advocate of the transatlantic relationship, it was pretty pessimistic analysis. In the end, Germany is frankly the only country, in my view, that has the economic potential, the wherewithal, to really make good on its own security vision, right, of its own strategy. All the other European allies, most of them are trading capacity for capability. Germany has the potential to have both. The Zeitenwende is a welcome shift. I believe it is real, as you do. It's a real sea change, at least in the outlook. That's what I hear from people inside the German government that I speak with and German think tank experts on the outside. That said, the implementation is lacking so far. And I think there's a broad agreement inside and outside Germany of the shortcomings. So that remains to be seen. But I agree with you that Germany is the linchpin. And then, sir, your question about interdependence. I was, of course, using that word from more of a policy practitioner perspective than an academic or theoretical one. But I use that primarily to mean the notion that the West could somehow achieve peaceful coexistence through economic trade and co-development and engagement with the Russians. I think that dream has ended. And I look to not merely the rhetoric emanating from my country or from the UK perhaps, But when you hear the Germans, and specifically an SPD-led government, talking in these terms, that's really noteworthy. And I think that there's now an emerging consensus, if you will, in the heart of Europe, that previous goal of interdependence, change through trade, that was misplaced, and it cannot be the future policy even after this war ends. That's why I believe it's a dream. And then finally, the question about the Northeast Passage, the Northwest Passage, and the role of NATO in the Arctic. I think that my country, as expressed through the National Defense Strategy and the National Security Strategy, clearly views the Arctic as a region of increasing importance. It won't displace the Indo-Pacific theater, but increasingly important. But also an area where we are going to be looking for multilateral solutions. And the Arctic Council is a critical one in that regard. I would see that as an area, the Arctic in particular, one where the U.S. is going to expect the allies to play a greater role. As the Arctic, due to climate change, becomes increasingly navigable, even as my country invests in icebreakers, and I think there are two more in the, two new ones in the budget for us. Again, it's going to be a multilateral solution set that we look for, and I think we're not going to let it distract us from our focus on the Indo-Pacific. And so we would hope countries like Finland, like Sweden, can increase their role there. This is the global commons, right? And as I mentioned at the outset, Europeans care about the global commons just as much as Americans do, whether it's north of Europe or all the way over in the Indo-Pacific. And so we will look to Europeans to play an important and increasing role in defending those global commons.
Thank you. 2 points. First, to follow up what was said about decision making and member states retaining their full sovereignty and national control in the alliance. I think it's very important to sort of recognize that we have 2 points of influence as a NATO member when NATO would be making a decision of a new operation. First of all, it would be a consensus decision in the North Atlantic Council, where Finland would have 1 seat and possibility to veto if needed. And secondly, we would make a separate national decision on deploying Finnish troops to NATO's operations abroad. And secondly, about the Arctic region and High North, it is very important for us. If we look at Finland's strategic position, it is like we are in the middle of a triangle. One end is High North, one end is Baltic Sea region, and the third one is North Atlantic Sea lines of communications. And we are in the middle of that triangle. So from our perspective, it is important that NATO is now paying more attention to the High North, increasing situational awareness, increasing exercises, and etc. And it's also important for the whole alliance that NATO is able to take care of the sea lines of communications in the North Atlantic. That is the precondition for Europe to be able to receive reinforcements from Northern America if needed.
Thank you. Okay, Matt.
Just 2 very quick points. The questions were mainly for John, but maybe first on René Nyberg's question or comment on Germany. I once heard someone calling Germany as the litmus test of European defense, referring to the fact that with its economic potential and just a geographic role at the heart of Europe, what Germany does or does not with its defense is really decisive in terms of the future of a more capable Europe. And then a second point, mainly as a sneak peek into our coming report, heard the word sea lines of communication, we argue that given Finland's role in the northeastmost part of Europe, behind the Baltic Sea, kind of hard accessibility, one driver of Finland's NATO policy will be the fact, the peripherality, and the focus will be on first and foremost on the Baltic Sea lines of communication. NATO's ability to protect them and ultimately defend them will be a core interest of Finland in the alliance.
Okay, I think we have still time for one more patch of questions, 2 to 3 questions, I would say. And we had gentlemen here at the back, at least first, then gentlemen over here, and maybe one more question. Anyone? Well, you have time to. Okay, Juha Pykänen. If there is time, we'll give the floor to you. But first, gentlemen over here, and then Juha Pykänen, the last one. Yes. Yeah.
A former permanent secretary for foreign ministry. I would like to continue a little bit on the decision making and the need for more speedy decision making in NATO. I guess that we all have certain member states in our thoughts today, and that is of course giving us a sort of a concern here in Finland. My question is whether you consider bilateral or regional cooperation as a way to get around a problematic situation in the NATO decision-making process to make, let's say, the reaction more speedy and effective. Thank you.
Yes, hello, my name is Nouti Kivere. I work for the European Commission here in Helsinki. This question is pretty much for the whole panel, but of course it would be great to hear from Professor Dennis the American view. The current war in Ukraine has so far showed that the Americans are still doing bulk of the European defense. You talked about the US drawing its attention to Indo-Pacific and not letting any distractions to challenge that. But how do you see, let's say, 5 years, 10 years from now, if there's another conflict again in Europe? Are the Americans going to be forced to come back, or what are the roles that the US could play in Europe to get the Europeans to kind of bolster their own defense? Thank you.
And then one more. Juha Pykänen, you go last.
Yes. Thank you, Iro, and sorry to take the floor again, but such a unique opportunity to challenge Professor Denny about terms, concepts, or definitions. Deterrence by denial or by revenge, or takeover, retakeover as an option. So you used word denial. You really mean that there will be forces and capabilities enough in this nearby region to deny? Or is there a different, a bit softer definition for term deterrence by denial? Or is it something taking over after something bad has already happened? In my mind, I have the Baltic states in my mind for this particular reason. And that was also a touch, let's say, analyzed in the US Army War College publication 2019. Thank you.
Okay, please.
Thank you. With regard to NATO decision-making, a bilateral defense agreement is just as it describes, a bilateral one between, in this case, the U.S. and Finland, and that agreement will spell out the modalities of defense cooperation between Finland and the U.S. So I don't want to prejudge what may or may not be in that agreement, but I can tell you that there are several current NATO allies that have pursued a strengthening of the bilateral relationship between the U.S. and themselves. Foremost in my mind is the example of Poland, which has been a NATO ally for many years, nonetheless has pursued increasing bilateral cooperation for this very reason, because they are concerned that in the face of what we might think of as kind of an ambivalent threat environment signal, that NATO may not be fast enough. I mentioned earlier one of the challenges the alliance has is this high bar of Article 5. It's a high threshold. And then the nature of the alliance as collective defense arrangement means it's necessarily engaged in response and reaction. So to Poland, it makes sense. They want to have more American involvement in any kind of security challenge they might have. This makes sense. Whether Finland would pursue that kind of a relationship, I leave that to Finland to decide. But it's a possibility, I would think, in future relations as an ally to try to engage more bilaterally. We've seen other allies do this, I think, for the very reasons you expressed. On the question about the bulk of the U.S., the bulk of the effort in Ukraine now being done by the U.S., if it's one thing we've learned in this, there are many takeaways from the current conflict, even though it's not ended yet. But one of the things we've learned is no matter how many shells or boxes of ammunition or armored personnel carriers you think you might need in a conflict with the Russians or the Chinese, triple it, right? Because the challenge that we're seeing now is our European allies are running low in their stocks, as Mr. Borrell has said, among others. So the U.S. is carrying the bulk of the effort right now. I think that's going to shift over time as European defense industry hopefully begins to speed up a bit. It will certainly shift once the conflict has ended and we are focused on reconstruction in Ukraine. I think we'll expect the EU to do much more. In terms of looking ahead to see where the U.S. might re-engage, let's say the U.S. continues to focus on the Indo-Pacific at the expense of its presence or focus in Europe. From my perspective, Europe is and will remain an absolutely vital theater for the United States. And I say that based upon the cultural relationship we have with our European allies. The economic relationship is second to none. If you look at the number of jobs that are directly tied to U.S.-EU trade investment, that's about 2.5 million U.S. jobs. The number of jobs that are directly tied to trade investment with China, under 1 million. If you look at the volume of trade and investment between the U.S. and the EU versus the U.S. and China, much higher in Europe, right? There are real tangible but also intangible reasons why Europe is a vital theater for us, vital to our interests, to America's interests. And so it seems to me that even 10 years from now, if the bulk of U.S. rotational forces, for example, are taken out of Europe because the Russian threat has faded, and there again emerges some Russian threat or some other threat, I would think that the United States would engage and do what is necessary to protect its allies here. I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. And then finally, sir, deterrence by punishment versus deterrence by denial in the Baltics. NATO has said it wants to shift to a posture of deterrence by denial. That is, of course, very difficult to do in the Baltic states where there's not a lot of strategic depth. But there's another equally tangible reason why, and that's because the allies, most of them at least in Europe, don't have the capacity to dramatically increase their force structure in the Baltic states. This is a challenge I identified in the book that I just spoke of that came out last year, and I mentioned earlier, most of our major European allies, including the 5 that I mentioned, are giving up capacity to invest more in capability. That trend is one that's going to continue through the rest of this decade. But on the receiving end, there's a challenge in the Baltic states. They lack the infrastructure in terms of training areas, exercising areas, barracks, etc., to support brigades and larger in their countries. I think for now the alliance has a lot of work to do to achieve deterrence by denial in the Baltic states. But I think the objective is indeed to prevent any square inch or square meter of Baltic state territory, or hopefully, when Finland joins the alliance, Finnish territory, to be taken over by the Russians. And that does indeed mean having more of a presence on a regular, continuous basis on or near the border to prevent, rather than to simply fall back and try to reclaim territory. We've seen what that looks like in Ukraine, and that's nothing that anybody in NATO wants to go through.
Maybe one point about the speedy decision making. I will not comment the US-Finnish agreement, but more generally, I believe bilateral and multilateral cooperation can play a role before NATO as a whole will be engaged in handling the situation. But also, I would emphasize that coalitions cannot replace NATO. In a possible Article 5 situation, it's about a collective decision by NATO allies, and it's about implementing the plans made exactly for such situation.
Briefly on the US future role, I fully agree with John's point that the aim of US policy right now, just if you look at the sums, is not only to support a strategic partner, but also to weaken a near-peer adversary, namely Russia, and I think it's in Europe's interest that US and NATO more broadly succeeds in this strategy. That said, when it comes to the future, the US will be needed. As I pointed out in my opening remarks, I'm somewhat concerned of the divergence of threat perceptions and whether the allies, more protected ones, will ultimately be ready to significantly bolster their defense. There will be countries on the eastern flank, in the north, Finland, Estonia, Poland, who will undoubtedly be more capable in the future. But the US will be needed as just enablers, material depth, intelligence, and US role will remain crucial. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, brilliant. I think we're just in time. It's 4 p.m. So I think it's time to call it already. This seminar is now finishing, but first I would like to give a huge applause to our brilliant panelists, especially Professor Denny for flying all the way from the United States to come and talk to us today, our wonderful Karolina Honkanen from MOD, and our very own Matti Peso. So, and thank you so much for all of you for participating and also asking these really thought-provoking questions, and we hope to see you soon again in one of our FIIA events. Thank you.